my time in court and half my time doing policy work with the Utah State Legislature. So again, just volunteering and being willing to take on some extra work because it was something that interested me, really turned into an opportunity to learn a lot and some fantastic contacts and some fantastic opportunities. I was at that office for about 5.5 years, and one day, really out of the blue, got a call from Governor Huntsman's office asking me to direct the Utah Sentencing Commission, which was something when I was sitting here in, as a political science student or even in law school, not a job that I would even think existed or that I knew what it did. But I will tell you what it does in case it's of interest to you. So the Sentencing Commission is not a body that actually sentences anyone. So people used to always tell me they were scared of me. Like, I have no authority at all. What they did is a statutory organization that, or statutory commission that is tasked with advising the legislature, advising the governor, and advising the courts on sentencing and release policy in the state of Utah. So I spent all of my time working on legislation and policy matters. My commission was charged with publishing the Utah Sentencing Guidelines, which are the guidelines that sentencing judges use to sentence people and the State Board of Pardons and Parole uses in determining when to release people from prison when they have been sentenced there. Worked on lots of evidence-based policy issues and things along those lines, but really from that capacity got to work with every branch of government on policy issues, which was really, really just an amazing opportunity. While I was there, as was mentioned, I had the opportunity to, for several years, to be the president of the National Association of Sentencing Commissions and work on a national level with best practices and policy works and meet people from around the country who are working on similar things. Do you have a question there?
Clarifying question. A lot of these government commissions are staffed by people that do it part-time that have other careers, but is the Sentencing Commission a full-time job?
It is, yes.
Okay, so it's one of those where all of the members of the commission?
No, so the staff is full-time. So as the director, my job was a full-time job, but I represented the commission, which was a 29-member commission that was made up of stakeholders from across the state. So it was made up of judges, it was made up of legislators, it was made up of victim advocates, it was made up of community members, the head of the Department of Corrections, the Department of Public Safety, all of those different stakeholders that have an interest in criminal justice were members of those commissions, part-time and in their official capacity. My job was to take what they directed me to do and put it into action and to do the research to help them make informed decisions, and then to push their policy recommendations through the legislature with the governor and to help facilitate it through the courts. So I really did get to work on every end through those kinds of things. Most of our state commissions are just like that. In fact, we only have, I'm going to misspeak because I'm saying this, I think we only have 2 or 3 commissions that are full-time here in the state of Utah. One of them would be like the Board of Pardons and Parole, right? That is a board where the members are full-time members. That is their job. Tax Commission is another kind of thing where those commissioners are there. Those are actually those are parts of the governor's cabinet as well. Otherwise, we have those part-time commissions. And I'm happy to answer questions there too, and I would actually encourage you, is when we get to my job as general counsel to the governor, one thing we did is advise on appointments. We have, I'm going to misstate, hundreds and hundreds of boards and commissions in this state with that are always in need of people to serve on them. Some of them require expertise and some of them don't, but
it comes back to your point about volunteering. That's
absolutely
an excellent way to provide to volunteers.
Yeah.
To get involved in this.
And in fact, I will tell you right now, this is something to keep in mind just while we're here. If you go to governor.utah.gov, there will be a link there to boards and commissions. It will give you the list of all of the state commissions, and they range from issues related to sentencing, to water policy, to dairy farms, to, anything, the Heber Creeper, anything you can think of, we have a board that addresses them. You can scroll through that, and there will be, there's an application to go forward, and it'll tell you if there's a vacancy too.
On all those commissions, are the backgrounds for the people on those boards usually a law degree as well, or do you have some master's in policy or other?
So the question is, do the boards require a law degree or a master's degree or something like that? I will say this, it depends on the board and it depends on the position. So on some boards, there are very specific positions that require someone with experience or a background in this. Some of them require someone who has, very specific degrees or a background or works in a particular industry. Some of them, in many instances, you need general public members that have no particular expertise but are there to represent the public. So every board is different, every makeup is different, and so it will just depend on the board. But there are plenty of opportunities to serve, so keep that in mind there. So that was just a fantastic opportunity for me to get to do, again, this great intersection of legal work and policy, which has really been the great opportunity of my career to get to do kind of both those things that I love a lot. I served in that capacity for 5 years. I think I did 5 or 6 legislative sessions as the director in that period of time. I will say some of the things that I am most proud of my career were the policy issues that we were able to work on and push through in that capacity. And I'll kind of give a couple of examples here. So for instance, when I started my career as a prosecutor, I actually started as a juvenile court prosecutor and was really was struck almost immediately by some of the flaws in our statute, some of the really harsh sentencing issues that we had, some of the really just areas where we didn't give judges any discretion and we'd have to transfer kids from juvenile court to an adult court in areas where we would just really truly set them up to fail. My job was to implement the law, and I watched that law in many instances fail. So when I had the opportunity to help inform a commission and change a lot of those policies, we really focused on a lot of the research, and we were able to do a lot of those things. One of the great things about the state of Utah is we are such a great size, where we have amazing people who are very talented and very skilled. But at the same time, we're small enough that we work together really well, and we know that we're going to have to work together again. That combination of talking to each other and working together well and having just the perfect number of resources really helps us facilitate some really great policy moves and positions. One of those areas that we worked on was, again, charging juveniles as adults and moving them to the adult system. And one of the great things that I got to do this summer was actually meet an individual by the name of Brian Stevenson, who started a Justice Institute in Alabama where they really fought for a lot of reforms in the criminal justice system, one of them being rights for juveniles. And he pushed a case that went through the Supreme Court that really opened up the way for a lot of these reforms. I was in this job about that same time and got to move some great things kind of in his wake. And it was really fun to meet him and thank him for those kinds of things. But those kinds of policy issues, truly, when I look at all that I've done, are some of the most rewarding things and things that I am very most proud of in that regard. I served in that position for 5 years when the governor's former general counsel, who is now Justice John Pierce, who serves on the Utah Supreme Court, was appointed to the Court of Appeals at that point in time. And Governor Herbert asked me to come and serve as his general counsel. I have to tell you that it is one of the most terrifying opportunities that I have ever had. I served as the governor's general counsel for 4 years, really almost exactly 4 years, until about a week and a half ago, is where we were in that regard. That job was one, again, a very unique combination of policy work and pure legal work. I was in that regard, worked very closely with the Attorney General's office. The Attorney General's office is tasked with providing the state with all of its legal representation. So anytime the state gets sued, and we get sued a lot, the Attorney General's office represents us in that regard. They represent all of our agencies. They represent the governor. They represent the lieutenant governor. They represent the auditor and the treasurer. They represent everyone in that capacity. So I worked very closely with them in state litigation. I worked with the governor's cabinet members on different legal issues that came before them. So when something looked like it was going to break bad or could break bad or had really significant implications, of course, they worked with their attorney general, but they would call me to work through issues, talk through issues, make sure that they were making really good decisions. If there was some risk associated with it, to make sure that we didn't ever surprise the governor, that we knew what was going on. And got to work through a lot of those kinds of things. So in that capacity, I got to work on everything from labor issues to human resource issues, tax issues, finance issues, anything that you can imagine. Again, criminal policy issues, budgeting issues, anything that happens in this state, I got to work on. I used to tell people in my office, my staff and I, we literally and figuratively put out fires. One of the other things that we did was issue emergency declarations when we had literal fires, or we needed to approve to send people out, just like we've seen this week with the wildfires in California, sending our state resources to help those folks there. So we got to be involved in all of those different kinds of capacities in that regard. As I mentioned, as his general counsel, I was also his legislative director, which is somewhat, I think, surprising when I talk to other general counsels across the country, because being general counsel in and of itself is an overwhelming and all-consuming task. Being a legislative director is also overwhelming and all-consuming. So the two of them are not necessarily compatible at all times, but the reason that the governor structured things that way is that he wanted to make sure that as he was evaluating legislation and he was looking at whether or not to sign it and in implementing legislation, he wanted to make sure that he understood objectively, not only politically, but objectively, what the legislation did and what its effects were going to be. So my job as legislative director was to work with the legislature as they developed policy. So it's not uncommon for a legislator to call me and say, hey, I'm thinking of doing this. And this was one of my greatest goals, is that we would have the kind of relationship where they would in fact do this. So they would call me and ask, we're thinking of doing something like this. What do you think? What is your input? What would you recommend? Do you mind if I send you a draft? We're always happy to do something just like that. That's how things would start. As we worked down the path, we worked really closely with our agencies to make sure that the legislature was not only able to work with them, but really wanted to reach out to our subject matter experts to make sure that they were getting the best information possible as they developed these laws. We worked with them very closely, and I'm going to come back to an example related to that there. So we worked very closely on them in that regard. My job also, though, is every piece of legislation, and Professor Monson's going to know this well, right? I think we, once again, in the state of Utah, have a record number of bill files that have been opened. There's usually last year I think we had somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500, the exact number escapes me, bill files open. Every piece of legislation that is given text and is numbered, it was my job to read that, to evaluate it, to analyze it, to consult with our agencies, to consult with the Board of Education, if that's whoever it involved, to consult with them to make sure that I understood, so that the governor could understand all of the impacts of that legislation. During the legislative session, not only did we read that legislation and analyze it, but then we would work really closely with them to make sure that they got it right. And that can be some of the toughest things. So I always say legislators would answer my phone calls mostly out of fear, because when the governor's general counsel calls you, it typically means, not always, sometimes that something is wrong, right? And they have to fix it. And when the governor's general counsel tells you that something is wrong and you have to fix it, if you take that down its logical steps, that means the governor has a problem with your bill, you need to fix it, or the consequence down the road may not be one that you wanted. But the governor's approach really was an inclusive one and is an inclusive one. He wanted someone in that position to do just that, because most bills in his view could be fixed. They could be put in a position where they could be implemented and they could be just fine. So rather than veto a lot of things at the end of the session, he would rather fix them along the way so that by the time it got to him, it was something that he could, in fact, sign. That was a weighty job, just so you know. That's a lot to do. Last year, there were 525 bills that passed. I was involved in almost every one of those in some regard or another, and many of those we needed to fix. Now, when I say we needed to fix, usually the policy in these was just fine. And in fact, I think this institute does some statistics on the number of bills that pass unanimously and some other things. We always like to look at those. A lot of bills that go forward they are technical corrections. They are non-controversial things that go through, and it's not that big of a deal. A lot of them, if they're policy issues, they're good policies. What they're trying to accomplish are good. The problem is the way in which they're either trying to accomplish it or the language they use in trying to do that. This is why the governor wants his lawyer to be the person who does that. So I'm going to kind of step back and I'm going to give you kind of an example here in from a few different contexts. But when you can imagine some conversations that I have with legislators, right? So your bill is fine, but we need you to change the following language. Well, if it's fine, then why do I have to change it? Well, because your bill doesn't say what you want it to say, right? I mean, you think that's what it says, but it's not what it says. Well, you know what I mean. I'm like, I may know what you mean, but when an agency is trying to implement what it is, they can't implement what they think you mean. They have to implement what the language says, right? They have to implement it exactly as it's written. And when we get sued, which we often do, or when a judge is trying to implement or interpret a statute, they can't go by what they think you meant. They have to go by the four corners of the language of the bill, right? They have to follow the four corners of the statute. That's their only option. So you hear the phrase that gets tossed around a lot as an activist judge, right? I've heard legislators actually ask judges to be activists in those categories where I've told them, like, your bill doesn't actually say what they think it says. Well, we can just interpret it that way there. When it's the opposite of what they want, right? They're interpreting it in a way that they don't want it to say, the criticism gets there. One of my favorite quotes that I've ever had to say, this was in a committee hearing, actually, so there is a record of it. I will not tell you the bill. But a very prominent member of the legislature, I was giving some testimony very similar to this, right, where we understand what it is that you're trying to do, but what you're saying here was creating some pretty high-level felonies for some really, really minor type of activity. And in doing so also encompassed a whole bunch of activity that we would never intend to be criminal. I can't tell you again because it'll make it all very public there. Maybe I should share it anyway. But a whole bunch of activity there. So the question here is, I'm explaining this to them, the response that they gave me was, well, we'll just trust the prosecutors and the judges and the law enforcement to make sure that doesn't get charged in that way, right? That was the response. And I actually had to say, there is a public record of me saying this, we generally try to not criminalize things that we don't intend to be criminal. Right? I mean, if we don't mean it to be something that someone can go to prison for, we probably shouldn't make it something that we can send people to prison for. It's that kind of thing that I spent most of my time doing. Again, it wasn't really big policy issues. We worked on those too. There are lots of really big policies that we worked on. But what we really focused on were those kinds of things where things were just not said the way they intended them to be said. But I knew that the agency was then going to have to implement it. And ultimately, this could be in front of a judge. And as I told you when I started, I was the person at one point in time who had to argue statutes that weren't well written, or who had unintended consequences, or that did things that they really didn't intend to do. So for me, it became really personal in that we really do need to only do what we intend to do. If we're not careful about what we say, then we could cause all of these unintended consequences. One of my favorite legislative experiences. Yes.
So how much do you work with LRGC? Just because the legislators in Utah don't actually write the bills themselves, so like they probably really don't see the difference at all. So do you do training for drafting attorneys, or because that seems more towards like their writing ability than the legislators themselves?
So the question is, how closely do I work with the Office of Legislative Research and General Counsel? Have you had someone from their office come and speak to this group, or no? Okay. So the Office of Legislative Research and General Counsel is actually a really large office of staff for the legislators. They have policy analysts and researchers and then lawyers who actually draft the bills on their behalf. So the answer to your question is quite closely, but it depends on the legislator and it depends on the bill. So their general counsel is a gentleman by the name of John Fellows. His deputy counsel is Eric Weeks. I worked very closely with them on a high level about big policy issues, working back and forth. Oftentimes there would be bills that would come forward that I thought they probably needed to have a heads up because it was one of their other staff members who probably drafted it. So we worked closely with them. On an individual bill basis, it would frankly depend on the legislator. So some legislators, as I mentioned, would ask their staff to send it to me to get their input. Others intentionally keep things protected and don't want any input. And so that would be the case. And we wouldn't see it until it became numbered or it was public. So my job, and the way I viewed my job, is always to work very closely with them, and I will work as closely with them as they will allow me to work with them. And again, that just depends on a case-by-case basis. But a lot of really talented folks there who have a lot of expertise in drafting and looking for those little things. And we do a lot of training with them as well in that kind of area of things to look out for, things from, we've had cases that have interpreted things this way, and so we need you to be careful or look at these kinds of things. So it's been great. Yes, another question here.
If the consequences of changing the bill just means that the actual consequences happen, what's so difficult for the legislators to change the wording?
So the question is if the consequences are greater than changing the language, right? Or if there really are consequences they don't intend, why is it so hard? It's so hard because it's politics and there's a process. And every time you change it, people have to vote on it, or they may question it, or it's a pain to do it, or whatever it may be. And it does depend on where you are in the process. So one thing, is if you ever are working with the legislature, if any of you have done internships there with our state legislature, you'll know this. The further you get down the process and the closer you get to the end of the session, the more people don't want to hold something up by making a change because they want to get it through, and it's important to them to get it through. So it's not that it doesn't matter to them, but sometimes they don't understand truly the impact. And so my job was to try to help them understand why it was significant and why it really did matter, and to try to move things along. And so it could be because it's hard and it's bothersome. And sometimes really the delay could mean the difference between your bill passing or not. But as the person who then got tasked with implementing the bills, I'd say if it's not right, don't pass it, right? Because then it just causes us problems. Better not to do it at all and wait till next year. So one of my favorite examples of this, a couple of years ago, Representative Roberts, Mark Roberts from Santaquin, who is a good friend of mine, and so I do not share this story at all in any kind of way to do anything. In fact, I actually grew up in Payson. He's my parents' representative in that area. Representative Roberts ran a bill that would prevent executive branch executives, so cabinet members specifically, from taking positions on legislation. Okay, I want you to think about that for just a second. So, for instance, your director of the Department of Commerce couldn't take a position or weigh in on issues related to licensing or professional boards. The director of the Department of Health shouldn't weigh in to issues related to Medicaid or health services. Department of Human Services shouldn't weigh in to aging services or child welfare issues. The policy was, this is a separation of policy issue. We're the policymakers. You are not. So kind of stay in your lane, right, was the message there. So think about that for just a second there. So that was rather concerning to my cabinet members, you can imagine. The Hill is full of lobbyists and people who have positions and provide input and come up. And it's all welcome and it's all helpful and it's all informative. But from my perspective, the subject matter experts and people who really are the very best at understanding these issues, right, are the people with whom we charge to enforce these laws and put them into action and who do it 24 hours a day, and who in fact are hired because they are the very best at what they do, and they are the experts in that area. To say, we don't care what you have to say or we don't want to hear your input, just from my perspective, seemed like a really bad public policy. Just to kind of, again, though, illustrate how well we work together here in the state of Utah. So Representative Roberts obviously knew of our concern, and I had talked with him about it at length. His hearing was scheduled for a particular day that I was unavailable. And I don't testify on very many bills, but this was one that impacted agency-wide and across the entire state, and so something that I felt like I needed to weigh into. But I was unavailable. So I called Representative Roberts and I asked him if he wouldn't mind postponing his hearing so I could come and testify against his bill. And he was absolutely willing to do that. I thought that was incredibly gracious of him. He wanted to make sure that his hearing was fair, and we worked really well together. And so I was always very grateful for him for doing that. But my testimony in that regard to the branch was, or to the legislators on that particular committee, was this, right? Again, we are the people, so as we all work together, you pass laws, and we respect that right to pass laws, right? That is your job. You are the policymakers. You come up with the best policy possible with as much input as possible so it's informed. But then we're the people that you then hand that policy off to You give us your babies that you worked so hard on to put into practice. We're the ones who answer the phone when someone's calling to say, why did I have to do this? Or why did my child lose their driver's license? Or why did I lose my license? Or why did I have to pay this fine? We're the ones who do that. And we see the problems day in and day out. So not that you have to do what we say. We will implement whatever law you pass, but it seems like that should be really valuable input to you in one, how to administer these, where little hiccups might be, and frankly, whether or not it's good policy. You can ignore it or not, but you shouldn't, just out of principle, prevent yourself or deprive yourself of that kind of input. We had a really productive discussion about that, and the bill did not pass, and I've always been very grateful to Representative Roberts for his graciousness in that regard. But then, so that's through the legislative session, which is always just a fun experience and a lot of work and a lot of effort. But then everyone goes home, and they leave their piles of bills there for me and the governor to sort through. The governor has 20 days to determine whether or not to veto, sign, or let something go into law without his signature after the legislative session ends. So imagine they had 45 days to pass 525 bills, and that is a lot. And that's a lot of material that's going by really quickly. And as much as we try to stay on top of it, it's a lot of information. At the end, we then have 20 days to sort through all of it yet again and make sure that there wasn't anything that we missed. And as hard as we work during the session, there are always things that we miss. A lot of things that we miss. And so then we have to determine what we missed. Is it enough to mean that this needs to be vetoed? Is it okay? Is it something we can work with? Is it good policy? Is it not? What do we need to do in that regard? And as we work through the governor, that is the reason why the governor has his general counsel as his legislative director. So every bill that is passed, I then sit down through those 20 days, and we have a big group of people that we work with. We gather all the veto requests, whether they be from other legislators, from community groups, from whatever it may be. We gather all of those requests. Some of them come from our agencies. Some of them are recommendations that I make based on policy. Some of them are the governor's policy decisions. We gather all of those. We research them. We do everything we can to make sure that we then sit down with the governor with every bill, and we go through what the bill does. And my job as general counsel was not to make a policy recommendation to him, but to give him an objective overview of what the bill did. This is what the bill says. This is what the bill does. This is what the bill portends to do. This is what it will really do. These are the arguments that were made against it. These are the arguments that were made for it. Research backs up these, or evidence backs up these, or does not back up these. We give him that entire, really objective framework for what the bill does and is intended to do. And then he has to make a policy decision as to whether or not he goes forward with that bill. The governor does that with every single bill. We sit down with every one of them. Yes?
If you had to name a single bill over your time as general counsel that was the most difficult to do that with, what would it be?
To do the analysis, or to make a decision?
For the governor to make a decision, and how did your analysis play into that?
Okay. So I have to be a little careful with this, because as his lawyer, I am his lawyer, and so a lot of what we discuss there is privileged. But I will say one of the most difficult ones that we have seen, I can give a couple of examples, but one of them was recently with the .05 DUI law that was passed last year. That particular bill is a story. In the way it came about, the way it was passed, interest groups, and what they did or did not do. And one of the biggest problems with that bill, and why the evaluation really was so difficult, was because the bill was introduced, and to be completely candid, this is not a secret to anyone, no one thought it was going to pass. And in fact, this past year, there was another big piece of alcohol legislation that was going forward related to what we call the Zion Curtain and some other alcohol laws. And it was a very big bill that was very complicated and involved a lot of reform. So all of the lobbyists who deal with the hospitality industry, with retailers or wholesalers of alcohol, whatever it may be, all restaurant groups, everyone who has an interest in alcohol legislation, truly thought that was the bill that was going to pass, and that the .05 bill was not going to be touched at all. So that bill went through the House with no one paying any attention to it. I'll be honest. So if you go back and listen to the hearing, the House committee hearing on that legislation, no one testified against it. There is, I think, one citizen that showed up to testify against that bill. Now, you can imagine, and I don't know if any of you followed this, after the bill was passed by the legislature, there was a national and international campaign against the bill, which is kind of interesting. From, again, hospitality groups and different manufacturers of alcoholic products. But in the House, no one testified about that bill. I remember very specifically having some conversations with lobbyists, and I will tell you there are few industries that are better represented on the Hill than the hospitality industry, the restaurant associations, again, retailers, like just your stores, right, that sell things, that sell beer and other alcohol beverages, your convenience stores, so your wholesalers and your, there are a lot of lobbyists. There is a lot of money that is paid to people on the Hill to look at those issues. I remember having some conversations with them all. I'm like, I assume you're opposed to this? Are you going to say anything? Like, is there anything that's going to come up there? And they didn't. And so when it got to the Senate, there were a couple people who testified. It was not the most articulate or well thought out of testimony either. And frankly, again, I think everyone thought there was this understanding that it was not going to go forward and it wasn't going to pass. So when the bill passed and the legislators themselves, I'm going to get myself in trouble here, hadn't thought it was going to, and I've never had a bill where so many legislators called me and asked me to have the governor veto a bill than that one. People who voted for it would call in that regard. Or the industry itself that did nothing during the time coming back and asking the governor to veto a bill. My conversations with them really were some interesting ones. I mean, we certainly listened to them and got all of their input, as we do with everyone. I mean, the governor is very open to hearing that information. But one of the conversations we had is, what information have you provided publicly? I mean, there is no public record of any opposition to this bill. It was a very, very interesting thing. So I've never seen something after the fact receive so much opposition that as it was going through, there was just silence. Just a really, really interesting story. And that has a whole bunch of behind-the-scenes stories in the Utah legislature. It's just a fascinating story. But that, I would say, is one of the most difficult ones to do. What the governor ended up doing, that particular bill actually has a 2-year delayed implementation date. And so part of what the governor did, and he signed the bill, but made it very clear to the president and to the speaker that and they were in agreement with this, is that there are things that we need to come back and refine. In particular, and I'm again, I don't mean to be critical of people, but no one really thought it was going to pass, and everyone just thought it was the .05 bill, and they didn't read the bill. And there is also a provision in that particular bill that talks about novice drivers. If someone moves to the state of Utah from either another country or from another state, or gets a driver's license as an adult, you are actually what we call a not a drop driver for, I can't remember if it's a year or 2 years, I'm gonna have to go back and look, but essentially meaning it's a no tolerance alcohol level. So it would be, if you moved here from another country and got a driver's license as an adult, so juveniles are already a not a drop driver, have a zero tolerance policy, you could have a 0.0001 blood alcohol level, and you would lose your license and be charged with a DUI. So that's one of the things that they've got to go back and look at there. Matthew, did you have a question?
How is it possible for them not to know that a bill will pass? Don't they take the back room, the Republicans count who's
Yeah.
and so that one just nobody counted?
When I say this one is a fascinating story of Utah politics, it really is. So again, it was one of those where everyone thought that big alcohol bill related to the Zion Curtain was the alcohol bill. And the House passed it because it was their House member. I'm going to get in lots of trouble for this here. I'm really not. This is a very public story. Passed it over thinking that it wouldn't be passed by the Senate. That is a very common game that is played, just so you know. The Senate will pass things knowing that the House won't pass it, but they can support their member and send something over. The House does the same thing. This one was not prioritized by the House. If you watch kind of the way things work, the last night, the House controls the Senate board and the Senate controls the House board. This bill was not prioritized by the House, meaning it wasn't on the Senate board. However, the Senate sponsor at the very last minute pulled it up and had kind of, without people really knowing, had secured the votes, but the people who were interested in watching weren't aware of that and passed it at the very last minute. Caught everyone very much off guard. yeah, it was a very, very interesting story there. Yes?
Understanding that not many people wanted this bill to pass anyways, why didn't Governor Herbert just not sign it?
So the governor, that is an excellent question. Why didn't the governor sign, or why did he sign it? Why didn't he veto it? And this is why this was a really difficult decision there. He was supportive of the policy. It wasn't a great process. It was a terrible process for both the legislature, for the public, for everyone who was involved. And so people felt very unsettled with it because even though it had the hearings and went through a process, the public the input wasn't there because everyone kind of ignored it and thought it wasn't going to pass. He's supportive of the policy, but realized that it needed refining. And because there was the 2-year implementation date, he signed it with a charge. And so we've been working with the Transportation Committee and the Utah Substance Abuse Advisory Committee to come up with some refining changes for that. So knowing that we have time to do that, got commitments from people that we would in fact come back and address it, that it would go, and that would be the way that he did that. But it was a tough decision in that regard. Again, and it didn't go into effect immediately, so likely you could have just said the same thing, right? Why not veto it and come back and do it right the next time? So that was one of the really difficult decisions there. But so that is that. So we always say everyone else has a 45-day session. We have a 65-day session. It is exhausting, but I will tell you, it has been an incredible honor to work with a governor who takes things so seriously and who really is so thorough, who won't just, he doesn't just let me put things in front of him and sign them. He really wants to have that analysis. But I've also always appreciated this, and he gets criticized for this, for not vetoing more bills. People sometimes view that as a weakness. He works very hard through the session, as I said, to fix things as they go along, and he is committed to doing that. He recognizes the work that legislators put in. He recognizes the work that advocates put in, and he wants to if we can get it right, he wants to get it right. It requires a lot of work for his cabinet. It requires a lot of work for his general counsel. It is an exhausted period of time, but the result, I think, is one that really serves the state of Utah well. And again, make sure that we have a really good working relationship with our legislature and that we are able to go through and refine those things. Sometimes it's painful. Sometimes people don't want to change things, but we're usually able to get to a place where we can and we can get them fixed and we end up with some really great policy for the state. So I do want to leave some more time for questions, and I don't know how long the class actually is supposed to go.
Just a few more minutes. We're
Okay.
basically-
Okay, we're out. Okay, I want to give you just my favorite lessons that I have learned. These are not typical career advice lessons, but I want to share those with you. Just remember as you're starting your career that the people you hear at these microphones speaking to you are very well into their career. Everyone has a beginning story of their career that is not glamorous, that was not easy, where they stumbled and they had to find their way. Don't be discouraged by that. Remember, you make your way to the end only by making your way through things. And sometimes there's going to be some difficult times and you're not going to know which direction you're going. Embrace that. And as I said before, take advantage of every opportunity that you can to learn. I had a staff attorney once. I asked them to work on a particular project, and their response to me was, I don't ever really plan to do anything like that. It's not of any interest to me. I don't really want to do it. And in my mind, I thought, more knowledge never hurts anyone. More knowledge is always more knowledge. It will always benefit you. My career, I think, is a really good example of that. Things that I just volunteered to learn about or work on because, again, more knowledge is more knowledge, has come back to a time where I'm sitting in a meeting and suddenly I have context for something that I would have never thought would cross my path again. Just, again, I tell you, never turn down an opportunity to learn about something, no matter how bizarre it seems or no matter how far out of your lane it is. And finally, and I will be really quick about this, treat people well. Treat people really well. One of my favorite kind of little quotes out there is, if someone is nice to you and they're mean to the waiter, they are not a nice person. You will see that in your careers as you go along over and over again. As a lawyer, I've watched people treat court clerks badly. What they don't realize is that court clerk is the person who talks to the judge the most. If you are a terrible person outside of the purview of the person that you really want to get to, that will get to them, and it catches up with you really quickly. I've watched people applying for judgeships. I've had the opportunity to advise the governor on 81 judicial appointments to the Utah courts out of 116 total judges. I've watched people apply who call and treat our staff terribly. If you don't think that our staff tells me how that person treated them before I walk in to interview with the governor, and I can tell someone, you know what, this is not a person that we want to give power to. They are not going to use it well. And don't do it just for show. Do it for real. I mean, be generous in your opinions of people. You are going to mess up. I promise you, you are going to mess up. You want someone to treat you as generously as they can, that you want them to give them the benefit of the doubt. Do the same for others. Be the person that they want to work with. Be the person that they can trust, that they can rely on. Competence sounds like a very minimal standard, but competence, being that person that people can rely on, goes a really, really long way. Be someone that they can trust. Your reputation, you will find as you go throughout your career, is really the only thing that you have. And as big as you think this world is, professional circles are very, very small. Your reputation will follow you. I used to teach at the police officers training and standards on testifying and other things, and I would tell the officers this: it will take your entire career to build your reputation. It takes one moment to destroy it. No case, no project, no deal, no anything that you will ever work on will be worth that reputation. It really is the only thing that you take with me, and it's the thing that I'm most grateful for. When I had my little farewell event with the governor, the thing I told them that meant the most to me of that job was the fact that the governor's very incredible cabinet members, who are incredibly competent people, would pick up the phone and call me when they had a problem. When they were at their, kind of most crisis moment, that they would call and want to talk with me about that issue is the most humbling thing and the most rewarding thing I could think of to happen in a career, right? Be that person that people can trust and that they can count on. And I am happy to stay afterwards to answer any questions that you have.